Captain Rhys Sterling thought he'd escaped the relentless British Navy, when an eerie fog revealed something far worse. A ghostly ship from legend, the Devil's Dirge, captained by the vengeful spirit of Ashford Wren. Cursed and marked by supernatural forces, Rhys must battle through dark jungles, confront powerful sorcery, and face the dead in a fight for his very soul. Can Rhys break free from Wren's haunting grasp before it consumes him? And what secrets did his father's past leave buried in the deep? The fog pressed thickly around the iron wraith, curling like ghostly fingers across the ship's dark deck. Captain Rhys, the Raven Sterling, kept his grip on the helm tight, his sharp gaze trained on the impenetrable gray ahead. The British Navy fleet was behind him, outpaced and left snarling somewhere beyond the mist, and a satisfied smirk tugged at Rhys's lips. "Outwitted 'em again, boys," he called, though his voice only echoed off the fog. But beside him, Murdoch, his first mate with a face weathered like driftwood, narrowed his eyes, his hand clenched tightly around a tarnished silver talisman hanging from his neck. "Captain, the sea's gone too quiet," he muttered, his voice low as if afraid the fog might overhear. "This isn't natural. Something's lying in wait." Rhys chuckled, though the laughter held little mirth. "The British can try all their tricks, but they'll not catch the Raven. Their little parlor tricks mean nothing to the open sea." Before they could ponder it further, a dim spectral glow broke through the fog, a light that seemed to hover, flickering like lanterns that had long lost their flames. The sight turned Rhys's blood to ice. The glow grew brighter, forming the outline of a ship where no ship should be, its sails tattered and faint as mist. Murmurs rippled across the crew as each man turned to watch the haunting figure take shape, and a silence of disbelief blanketed them. The fog peeled back, revealing the Devil's Dirge, an ancient galleon shrouded in a deathly pallor. Its hulking masts rose against the moonless night like skeletal arms, and through its decks and boards drifted shadowy figures of men long dead, bound to the ship in eternal service. This was no ordinary vessel, but the lost ship of Ashford Wren, a notorious pirate whose legend spoke of betrayal, a terrible curse and a fate worse than drowning. A shadow of fear flickered across Rhys's face, though he hid it well. "Haul the anchor," he barked, a tremor creeping into his voice. But the Devil's Dirge wasn't waiting. Like a phantom possessed of its own will, it cut across the water toward them, its ghostly crew swaying in silent procession on its deck. Chains dangled from the masts, and the dull clinking sounded like rattling bones in the stillness. Yet the fog around it parted only for the dead, closing in heavier around the iron wraith, ensnaring it like a beast in a hunter's net. In the center of the Devil's Dirge, a spectral figure stood watching them with eyes that burned like smoldering coals. Ashford Wren, the cursed captain himself, spoke in a voice that carried through the fog, as if borne by a whisper from another world. "Ye thought ye could outrun me, Raven?" His eyes bore into Rhys with a cold, eternal hunger. "There's a debt to be paid, and your father left it for you." Rhys clenched his jaw, taken aback but unwilling to show weakness to his men. A debt his father owed. The man had vanished when Rhys was a boy, leaving only a legacy of riches and ruin. But he knew better than to argue with a specter, and desperation sharpened his tone as he issued orders to his terrified crew. "Turn her around," he shouted, the cold sweat slicking his brow unnoticed in the frenzy. But the Devil's Dirge had other plans. As the crew scrambled to turn the iron wraith, spectral shapes began to pour over the sides of the ghostly galleon, gliding across the sea toward them without oars or sails. Hollow-eyed sailors, some missing arms or half-rotten faces, clambered up the sides of the iron wraith with an eerie silence, their skeletal hands pulling themselves onto Rhys's ship as though summoned by a silent command. Murdoch met Rhys's eyes, his fear palpable, but he managed a grim nod. "We'll not go down without a fight, Captain." He drew his cutlass, though the blade looked fragile against the advancing spirits. Around him, the men stood frozen, paralyzed by the horror of the supernatural. Suddenly, Rhys's voice cut through the air like a lash. "Murdoch, the powder kegs. If we can't outrun the devil, we'll drag him to the depths with us." Murdoch understood immediately, turning and disappearing below deck to carry out the captain's order. Rhys's gaze stayed fixed on the ghostly captain of the Devil's Dirge, his hand ready on his pistol, the same hand that had seen him through dozens of battles. As the cursed crew of the Dirge closed in, The captain's shadowy form loomed over the decks, and Ashford Wren's voice rang out again, sharper and darker. "Ye can't escape what ye are, Raven. Your blood calls to this fate." The grip of fear held the Iron Wraith's crew as tight as iron shackles, the ghostly invaders moving over the deck with a silence that only heightened the terror. Captain Rhys Sterling shouted orders over the rush of adrenaline thundering in his chest, though even his voice betrayed a tremor. "To arms, you wretches! Cut them down, ghost or no!" Around him, his men roused to the call, blades flashing as they met the cursed crew with steel and desperate cries. But their weapons passed through the specters, the steel slicing air instead of flesh. One by one, his men faltered, their courage melting like wax in the face of an enemy untouched by mortal weaponry. For every cutlass that sliced, the specters only leered, a haunting smile spreading across hollowed cheeks. Murdoch reappeared, a grim set to his face as he shouted above the chaos. "Powder's set, Captain. When you give the word, we'll blow the Wraith and this cursed ship together, mark my words." He flashed a smirk, a glint of defiance in his eyes as he shoved a torch into Rhys's hand. The fuse lay in wait below deck, ready to ignite the barrels packed tightly in the hold. A single spark would send them all to the depths, but there was one snag: getting the crew off the ship in time. Rhys clenched the torch, his jaw set as his mind raced. "Hold steady, men!" he bellowed, waving the torch above his head. "Any who can make it to the lifeboats, make for the sea!" The torchlight illuminated his face, hard and unforgiving, and the sight rekindled hope among the men, sparking a renewed vigor in their eyes. Just as they surged toward the lifeboats, a low, eerie laugh cut through the fog. Ashford Wren, his figure half faded yet all too real, stepped forward from the thick of his ghostly crew. His eyes glinted with malice, a flicker of endless darkness. "Running are ye, Raven, and to think your father thought himself brave." The words froze Rhys. His father. Did this ghost truly know something about the man who had abandoned him, the pirate he had spent years wondering about? Hating? Wren grinned, seeing the question in Rhys's eyes. "Aye, lad. I knew him well. Saw him spit on loyalty and betray those who stood beside him. 'Twas he who left me to rot in these cursed waters." Rhys's grip on the torch faltered, doubt threatening to consume him. But Murdoch was at his side in an instant, his hand clamping onto Rhys's shoulder, grounding him. "Captain," Murdoch growled, his voice thick with urgency, "don't fall for his tricks. Whatever your father did, it's on him. You owe nothing to this monster." Rhys glanced at Murdoch, his oldest friend, and his resolve sharpened. Wren's curse had nothing to do with him, and he wasn't about to let his father's ghost haunt him any more than this cursed captain. Setting his jaw, he met Wren's dead eyes, his voice like iron. "Then let the curse die with you, Wren. I won't pay my father's debt." Wren's face twisted into a snarl, his spectral form flickering as if enraged by the defiance. But then, a sly smile curled across his cracked lips. "Oh, but you will pay, lad. You already have. For ye bear his mark, don't ye?" At that, Wren held out a ghostly hand, and a searing pain shot through Rhys's arm. A mark, a bloody, ancient sigil, began to burn into his skin, as if drawn by an invisible knife. The pain was fierce, like molten iron branding him, and Rhys gritted his teeth, refusing to scream. The mark glowed with an unnatural light, pulsing like a heartbeat, and he saw in Wren's eyes the satisfaction of a man who had secured his prey. Rhys knew then that escape alone wouldn't free him. Wren's curse was tied to his very blood, but a voice rose over the agony, a shout from one of the crew. "Captain, they're pulling back!" Rhys's gaze snapped to the ghostly crew, who were retreating to the Devil's Dirge, their hollow eyes fixed on him, satisfied smiles on their skeletal faces. Ashford Wren's form shimmered, his gloating eyes never leaving Rhys as he drifted back toward his cursed ship. "You'll see me again, Raven," Wren sneered. "As long as that mark bleeds, you'll know I'm near." With that, the Devil's Dirge began to fade back into the mist, its ghostly lanterns dimming until only shadows remained. The unnatural silence lingered, but the cursed ship had gone, leaving Rhys and his crew floating alone in the fog. Rhys's grip on the torch tightened, and he forced himself to breathe, the pain of the mark still throbbing on his arm. Murdoch placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "We got out, Captain. We're still breathing." His voice was steady, but there was a haunted look in his eyes. the lingering shock of seeing the dead walk aboard their ship. Rhys nodded, but his gaze lingered on the mark now seared into his skin, a reminder that his battle with Ashford Wren was far from over. The crew looked to him for orders, but for the first time, the weight of this new curse bore down heavily on his shoulders. The encounter with Wren had left its stain, and he could almost feel the cursed captain watching from somewhere beyond, lurking in the shadows, waiting. Yet his voice held steady, masking the storm inside as he addressed his men. "We've faced the dead and lived to tell of it, but this curse, we're far from free. We'll seek out the sorcerer in the hidden coves of terrain. If anyone knows how to break this curse, it's him." His eyes held a dangerous gleam, one that promised they'd fight Wren to the ends of the earth if need be. His words stirred the crew, who nodded in grim agreement, ready to follow him to the ends of the seas and back. Rhys could feel the weight of their loyalty, but he also knew that with this curse came a danger he'd never faced before. Ashford Wren would return, he'd vowed it, and this time, the stakes would be even higher. The Iron Wraith cut through the storm-lashed waves, its crew silent and tense as the ship hurtled toward the shores of Terrain, a place shrouded in mystery and thick jungle, known only to those desperate enough to risk its hidden coves. Lightning flashed across the sky, casting eerie shadows over the dense foliage and jagged cliffs that rose like specters from the sea. The wind whipped at Rhys's coat, but his gaze remained steely, fixed on their destination. Somewhere on these cursed shores lay a sorcerer, a man who dealt in curses and shadows. If anyone could sever the bloody mark binding him to Ashford Wren, it was this elusive figure. Murdoch leaned close, his voice barely carrying over the howling wind. "You sure about this, Captain? If the tales are true, the sorcerer's magic can twist a man's mind, take his very soul." Rhys cast Murdoch a sidelong glance, his jaw set. "If that's what it takes to break this curse, then so be it." He lifted his arm, where the mark still burned beneath the skin, pulsing with a dark energy that felt almost alive, a constant reminder of Wren's chilling promise. They had left the ghostly encounter behind, but Wren's haunting threat lingered in the shadows, creeping into Rhys's mind with every passing hour. The crew brought the Iron Wraith into the shallows, eyes wide and wary as they beheld the twisted jungle rising before them, dense and foreboding. They made camp on the beach, fires casting flickering light across their faces, each man glancing nervously toward the dark tree line. By morning, Rhys and Murdoch set out alone, navigating the twisted paths leading deep into Terrain's hidden heart, every step feeling like they were being watched by unseen eyes. After hours of cutting through vines and ducking under twisted branches, they arrived at a cavern cloaked in shadows, a heavy, pungent mist hanging in the air. The entrance was marked with ancient symbols carved into the stone, and Rhys felt a chill crawl up his spine. This was no ordinary place. This was the domain of magic, and they were treading on dangerous ground. A voice echoed from within, low and smooth, as if the darkness itself were speaking. "Who comes seeking the knowledge of shadows?" Rhys straightened, his voice steady though he could feel the weight of unseen eyes on him. "I'm Rhys Sterling, captain of the Iron Wraith. I come to break a curse laid on me by the damned ghost of Ashford Wren." A figure stepped from the shadows, his skin a deep bronze marked with symbols that glowed faintly in the dim light. His eyes gleamed like polished obsidian, and a smirk played on his lips. "Ashford Wren's curse," he mused, circling Rhys with a measured gaze. "That mark on your arm binds you to the world of the dead, Captain. To sever it would be costly." Rhys's jaw tightened. "Name your price, sorcerer." The sorcerer's smile widened, revealing teeth sharpened to points. "Every curse has an origin, Captain, and to break it, you must face the one who placed it. You cannot simply run from Ashford Wren. You must destroy him, body and soul." Rhys felt the weight of the words, understanding at last that there would be no easy escape. Wren was bound to him, and only a final confrontation could sever the mark. The sorcerer turned, gesturing for Rhys and Murdoch to follow him deeper into the cave, where he revealed an altar of black stone. Upon it lay a tarnished silver amulet, covered in strange, writhing symbols. "This will draw him to you," the sorcerer explained, lifting the amulet and placing it in Rhys's hand. "Call to him in the dead of night. When he appears, drive the dagger into his heart, and his spirit will be shattered, lost forever in the abyss." Rhys nodded, his fingers tightening around the amulet. The sorcerer's voice was soft but laced with warning. But remember, should you fail, you will be his for eternity. There is no second chance, Captain. That night, under a sky thick with stars and ominous clouds, Rhys stood on the shore. His crew gathered around, their faces as tense and haunted as his own. He held the amulet aloft, and in a voice that shook with resolve, he called out, "Ashford Wren, show yourself and face me." The night fell into silence, the waves lapping quietly against the shore. Then, from the edge of the darkened sea, the cursed ship appeared, rising from the depths like a beast from a nightmare. The devil's dirge cut through the water without a sound, spectral flames licking its tattered sails, and its captain stood at the prow, his ghostly form illuminated by an unholy light. Ashford Wren's laughter echoed across the shore, cruel and mocking. "Did ye think ye could escape me, Raven? That ye could sever blood from blood?" His voice was filled with dark triumph, and Rhys felt the cursed mark throb in response, as if bound by the ghost's very words. But Rhys was done running. He lifted the dagger, its blade gleaming under the starlight. "I'll see you bound to the depths where you belong, Wren." And with a cry that shook his soul, he charged forward, Murdoch and his men close behind, weapons drawn, ready to face the dead. The ghostly crew poured from the devil's dirge, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and ragged clothes, the very essence of Wren's damnation. They moved with unnatural speed, their spectral forms slipping past blades and swinging fists. Rhys fought through the chaos, his only thought on Wren, who stood watching from the shadows, a cruel smile on his lips. Murdoch's voice rose above the din, urging the men to hold steady, to fight. But one by one, the crew found themselves overwhelmed by the spectral figures. Rhys knew he was losing time. With a surge of desperate strength, he broke free of the melee and charged toward Wren, raising the dagger high. Wren's smile faded as Rhys lunged, his hand plunging the blade into the specter's chest. A scream tore through the night, filling the air with an unholy wail as Wren's form shattered, disintegrating into a whirlwind of dark mist. The ghostly crew let out a shriek and began to dissipate, their bodies dissolving into the night. As the last of the specters vanished, Rhys fell to his knees, the mark on his arm burning one final time before fading, leaving only a scar. Around him, the remaining crew let out a shaky cheer, their voices weak but triumphant. They had faced the dead and survived. Rhys's gaze turned to the horizon, his thoughts heavy but clear. The curse was broken, but the memory of Ashford Wren would linger, a shadow over his life forever. Yet for the first time, Rhys felt the weight lift, the freedom he had fought so long to secure finally within reach. The dawn painted the sky in hues of crimson and violet as the Iron Wraith drifted through calmer seas, its remaining crew worn but alive, their faces showing a mixture of relief and awe at having faced death itself, and won. Rhys leaned on the ship's rail, the cool sea breeze washing over him, his gaze far away, still haunted by the night's battle. He absently rubbed the faint scar on his arm, the last remnant of the cursed mark, now a dull silvery line against his skin. Beside him, Murdoch was silent, his usually gruff expression softened as he took in the sight of the calm waters stretching endlessly before them. "That was close, Captain," he murmured, his voice low and thoughtful. "Thought we'd all be meeting Davy Jones down there with Wren cursing us for eternity." Rhys gave a wry smile, his eyes still shadowed but with a glint of hard-won peace. "Seems even the dead can be laid to rest, if you've the guts to face them." He turned, meeting the gaze of his loyal friend. "But this journey's cost us more than I care to count." Murdoch nodded, his face solemn as he looked out over the quiet waves. The Iron Wraith was wounded. Her sails were torn, her wood splintered from the violent clash with Wren's cursed crew. But the ship had survived, as had they. The crew moved slowly, their wounds and the memories of ghostly hands reaching for their throats weighing heavily on them. And yet beneath the fatigue was a resilience forged in fire and fear. As they worked, the men shared glances, each silently affirming the bond that had deepened with their struggle. These were no ordinary pirates. They were survivors of the supernatural, bound together by a night of unspeakable terror. The next morning, as the first light crested the horizon, a shadow passed over the deck. The crew looked up to see a frigate bearing the Navy's colors, a fresh reminder that even with Wren's curse broken, other threats lingered on the horizon. Rhys straightened, his eyes narrowing. calculating their odds in the face of the new arrival. But this was different. The frigate was alone, her cannons silent, her flags raised in what looked like a parley signal. Rhys considered for a moment, then nodded to his crew. "Hold steady, boys. If it's battle thereafter, we'll give 'em a fight. But if they've come to talk, well, we'll listen." The Navy ship pulled alongside the Iron Wraith, and from the frigate's deck, a naval officer in a pristine coat shouted across the gap, "Captain Sterling, a word, if you please." Rhys leaned over the rail, crossing his arms. "Speak your piece, Navy dog," he replied, his voice loud and unfazed. The officer's expression remained neutral, his gaze assessing. "The Admiralty has an offer, Captain. A pardon in exchange for information on certain ghostly events you've been involved in." He raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical of the tales that had already begun to circulate in taverns and ports alike. Rhys chuckled, shaking his head. "Pardon or no, the sea's where I belong, and I've no intention of swapping tales with the likes of you." His eyes gleamed with mischief as he leaned closer. "But let me give you a warning, Navy man. There are things out here in the deep that no warship or admiral can reckon with. Best keep to your laws, and leave the shadows to the ones who know how to fight them." The officer's face tightened, clearly unamused. "You're a fool if you think you can outrun both the living and the dead forever, Sterling." Rhys's smile only widened. "Perhaps, but I'd rather live free on the edge of death than cower behind walls." He gave a nod, signaling the frigate to clear off, and with a reluctant glare, the officer ordered his ship away. As the Navy ship receded, Rhys turned to his crew, his grin infectious, the tension broken by their laughter. They had seen the darkest of horrors and survived. No Navy, no curse, no ghost would ever hold them back again. A few days later, the Iron Wraith pulled into a hidden cove far from the reach of prying eyes and authorities. The crew docked to rest, repair the ship, and toast to their captain and their victory. They drank to the memory of those they had lost and the horrors they had defeated, sharing stories of battles fought and the strange gleam in Wren's ghostly eyes when he'd confronted Rhys. Later that night, as the crew drifted to sleep, Murdoch found Rhys standing alone on the cliffside, looking out over the moonlit sea. The calm waves sparkled, and the salt-tinged air felt like a balm on Rhys's worn spirit. Murdoch crossed his arms, a wry smile playing at his lips. "Thinking of giving it up yet, Captain?" Rhys laughed, shaking his head. "Not a chance, old friend. If the sea calls, I'll answer, curse or no curse." He looked down at his scarred arm, the mark now just a memory. "There's a freedom out here no man can take. Not Wren, not the Navy, no one." Murdoch nodded, his face softening. "Then here's to more adventures, Captain." Rhys raised an invisible glass, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Aye, to whatever the sea sends our way." The night wore on, and the Iron Wraith lay quiet, her crew resting, her captain ready for whatever fate might bring next. And though the curse was broken, the legends of Rhys Sterling and his battle with the dead would spread far and wide, stirring hearts and calling to those who, like him, sought freedom on the edge of the world. If this high-stakes adventure left you breathless, make sure to subscribe to You Pirate for more tales of the sea, mystery, and danger. Share this story with friends and set sail for the next adventure in the endless deep.